Speak to you today on the research being undertaken by WMU on work and rest hours for seafarers and recommendations made to the global maritime community. Let me first begin with a short introduction of the World Maritime University and its vital role in the maritime and ocean sectors. WMU was established in 1983 by the International Maritime Organization, and since then has made a major contribution to global maritime education, research, and capacity building with the financial support of the IMO, the Swedish government, the city of Malmö, as well as governmental and private sector donations. Since its establishment, WMU's legacy has been transformative, with an extensive network of leaders in the maritime and ocean sectors, with 5,392 WMU alumni from 170 countries to date. 90% of our graduates come from developing countries. We are proud to say that today, 1,181 of these graduates, that is 22%, are female, and we expect this number of female graduates to increase significantly in the coming years. Today, WMU graduates are to be found across the maritime, ocean, and port industries, representing their countries at the IMO, running maritime academies, and operating within the maritime industry. Some have occupied positions as prime ministers, government ministers, deputy ministers, ambassadors, representatives of their countries at the IMO, presidents of maritime academies, while many others hold senior positions in their maritime and port administrations as senior surveyors and in shipping companies, to name but a few. The current Secretary General of the IMO and the WMU Chancellor, Mr. Ki-Tak Lim, is a 1991 graduate of the university. My presentation today focuses on research carried out recently at WMU about an important topic, namely hours of work and hours of rest for seafarers. I will highlight the importance of conducting research in this area and the research work done on the topic. I will also highlight the recent work undertaken by WMU researchers relating to working and living conditions of seafarers, including rest hours and the implications. A number of recommendations resulting from this study will be presented. The regulatory framework for seafarers relating to hours of work and hours of rest are set out in two important international instruments. The International Labour Organization's Maritime Labour Convention, 2006, the MLC, as amended, and the International Maritime Organization's Standards of Training, Certification, and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, STCW 1978, as amended. Regulation 2.3 of the Maritime Labour Convention, MLC, as amended, which follows the provisions of the Seafarers' Hours of Work and the Manning of Ships Convention, 1996, number 180. This convention was the first instrument to introduce the requirement for seafarers to record their hours of work or rest to monitor compliance. Section A81 of the Seafarers Training, Certification and Watchkeeping Code of the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, STCW 78, as amended. These provisions were updated in 2010 to align them more closely with the relevant International Labour Organization requirements. These two instruments provide for the minimum requirements regarding seafarers' hours of work and rest, and to ensure their compliance through monitoring and enforcement. The importance of research on work and rest hours is vastly supported by evidence, showing the negative effects of long working hours and lack of sleep and proper rest on occupational health and safety on board ships, including high risk of injuries and accidents. Fatigue has a significant potential to impact negatively on ship safety, as well as on seafarers' occupational safety and health and their well-being. The 2019 IMO guidelines on fatigue states that fatigue has cognitive, physical, and behavioral dimensions that impair seafarers' performance and has long-term negative effects on their health and their well-being. The failure to comply with the minimum requirements for hours of work and hours of rest of seafarers means that they are in violation of the MLC and the STCW. The World Health Organization, its guidance clearly state that violations of hours of work and rest are associated with poor mental health, well-being of seafarers. Research on work and rest hours has become more critical amid the COVID-19 pandemic, with seafarers spending time at sea well beyond their period of service. In July 2021, it was estimated that 250,000 seafarers around the world continue to be stranded at sea on ships beyond the end of their contractual period and have not been able to be repatriated due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the related travel restrictions. A general overview of the impact and the response to COVID-19 on the maritime industry includes challenges seafarers are facing relating to quarantine requirements, restrictions on border crossings with border closures, as well as challenges for repatriation and crew changeovers, as well as abandonment. A recent study conducted by researchers of WMU in collaboration with other universities from Australia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom has explored seafarers' experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. The study concludes that long periods of time spent on board, together with an increase in workload for many of the respondents, heightened their levels of exhaustion, with over half of the respondents indicating that they felt exhausted and tired almost every day or every other day. These high levels of exhaustion are concerning because they can increase the risk of injuries as well as accidents. Indeed, with sustained high levels of exhaustion, there is also a risk of chronic fatigue, with negative consequences for seafarers' physical and their mental health. With respect to research on crew work and rest hours, what kind of research has been done in the past And what does this work conclude? Research on work and rest hours is not new, and there are numerous scientific evidence in literature of fatigue and inadequate reporting. Regarding fatigue, there is extensive and concurring evidence on the high prevalence of fatigue on board and its negative effects on crew health and ship safety. Previous research has also concluded that the widespread adjustment of work and rest records demonstrate underreporting of hours of work and adjustment of rest work hour records, and these have been suggested by previous research to be a common practice in the shipping sector. The issue, therefore, of adjustment has been quantified as between 62 to 69%. With this past research context and considering the high commitment of WMU to carrying out research on topics that matters to seafarers' welfare, their working and their rest hours, these have become a key element in this research commitment. WMU has recently conducted a major research project evaluating the implementation of the current regulatory framework in rest and work hours and its impact on seafarers, work that has been undertaken with the generous support of the ITF Seafarers Trust. The study undertaken takes into account two of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 3 on health and well-being, and Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth. The project's starting point reflected a simple observation. Why is fatigue at sea continuously pointed out in research despite the entry into force of the IMO and ILO instruments? With this observation in mind, WMU conducted the research to study the seafarers' recording practices and the implementation of work rest hours regulations. This qualitative study made use of semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, and case studies in order to gain an in-depth appreciation of seafarers' recording practices and a clear understanding of how different stakeholders deal with implementation, compliance, monitoring, and enforcement of the relevant provisions of the instruments of the International Labour Organization and the IMO. To collect a diversity of views, widen the perspectives, and taking into account multiple data sources, the research team collected data from 3 categories of participants. The first category was seafarers who were interviewed to confirm previous research, examine the onboard recording practices, identify failures in implementation, and analyze the justifications for the adjustments. The second relates to the need to diversify the perspectives and integrate other maritime analyses. The team that worked on the information collected data from maritime stakeholders, including representatives of shipping companies, professional maritime organizations, trade union organizations, and casualty investigation boards. Thirdly, a group of Port State Control officers were invited to share the inspection practices and highlight enforcement challenges. The research undertaken has shown that rapidly concurring pieces of evidence from seafarers confirmed the previous research and casualty investigations. A high prevalence of fatigue was confirmed by seafarers, but also by the rest of the maritime stakeholders. The rest work standards and practices adopted do not appear to be supported by science. There is a significant link between reduced manning and fatigue. The 6 on and 6 off watch regime is far from a solution. It may well be a contributor to fatigue. Far from being anecdotal, it would appear that the adjustments of work and rest records are widespread, which reflect an inefficient feedback with respect to the reporting system. The second implication concerns complacency in the record-keeping practices. The research noted some unexpected recording practices, such as appointing persons with instructions to make up records and the use of recording software to detect violations and erase them accordingly. The research also concerns the ship-to-shore communication. Seafarers highlighted the risk of reporting work rest hours violations to shore management, who tend to neglect such feedback or are concerned by the negative impact if they reported such incidents. Fear or perceived fear seem to be the main drivers behind adjustments of records. However, some key performance indicators and bonus systems also influence recording malpractices. Many seafarers also simply refrain from reporting non-compliance in order to avoid being questioned and the potential impact that their information might give rise to. Another important implication relates to the monitoring of compliance by Port State Control officers. When discussing the inspection practices about rest and work hours and the regulations, the Port State Control officers also provided similar answers as the seafarers. Port State Control officers recognized fatigue among seafarers and the complacency in record keeping, particularly in relation to rest and work hours. However, Port State Control officers confirmed that they really go beyond initial inspection requirements that do not explicitly require verifying the record's accuracy. As a result, aware of inspection limitations, seafarers prepare record accordingly. In short, inspectors control records for compliance, and there is no further investigation. The Port State Control officers justified the lack of in-depth analysis of records by stressing that they have numerous items to verify on each ship within a very short period of time. Due to the resource constraints, the verification of records accuracy is not a priority for Port State Control officers. Indeed, cross-checking is time-consuming and it is difficult to find clear grounds justifying such investigation and for action to be taken. In short, the verification of the accuracy of records offer a low return on investment with regard to the effort and the potential enforcement action to be taken. In short, a genuine culture of adjustment has been established among seafarers. Worryingly, the research noticed the transmission of the culture of adjustment from generation to generation. For example, some officers may often instruct junior officers and cadets to fake records, which can mislead surveyors and elude shore management blame. Such wrongful practices also erase significant operational challenges that affect the possibility to rectify the situation. The interviews with other maritime stakeholders confirmed the existence of widespread violations and the making up of records. Despite providing some nuances on the extent of the issue, nobody was surprised about it. It seems that all segments of the shipping community are aware of this situation. However, they tend again to neglect it. The problem appears accepted as inevitable because it does not trigger corrective action. In conclusion, there is a normalization of deviance, which seems tacitly accepted by the maritime community. The incapacity to address violations of rest and work hours and the complacency in record keeping reveal a systemic failure. Most seafarers do not record properly because of job instability and occasionally financial incentives. Most companies tend to ignore the issue when they report rest work hour violations. Port State Control officers also often overlook a strict implementation of rest work hours regulations. For research, some important questions have emerged. The first is the overwhelming majority of responses identified is inadequate manning at the origin of the issue. Participants stressed the need to align the regulatory framework with evidence-based research on fatigue. Chronic mistrust and conflicting agendas between shore and sea impact on feedback and on the corrective actions to be taken. And surveyors and inspectors really verify the records. The following recommendations are being set forward. First, the ILO and the IMO should initiate discussions on the implementation and enforcement of work and rest hours regulations and the related instruments. Legal practitioners should be encouraged to research the impact of work-rest hour violations and adjustment of records on the concept of seaworthiness. The ILO guidelines for flag state inspections and port state control officers should be revised in order to include systematic verification of the accuracy of records during initial inspections. Secondly, ILO and IMO should review tamper-proof monitoring, particularly the technologies limiting manual input and forging attempts. Ethically acceptable technology guaranteeing seafarers' dignity and data confidentiality should be identified. Seafarers should be encouraged to use existing reporting procedures, such as the ISM Code and the MLC 2006 as amended, its complaint procedures, to report any violations and malpractices. And fourth, the flag states and port state, particularly the port state control regimes, should recognize the importance of the human factor and the detrimental impact of insufficient rest on ship safety, work performance, and occupational safety and health. Therefore, flag states and flag state surveyors, port state control officers should be trained accordingly. In addition, inspections should target work rest hours and ensure the accuracy of records. Fifth, companies should ensure that mechanisms to improve shore-sea cooperation are put in place. Six, the maritime industry should promote stringent, objective, and research-based models for determining safe manning and their monitoring tools. 7, companies with the collaboration of maritime education institutions, the MET, the METs, insurers, seafarers, and other maritime players should initiate fatigue management programs incorporating work rest hours data and their verification. And 8th, but last but not least, companies with the collaboration of maritime education institutions, casualty investigators, seafarers, and other maritime players should initiate and strengthen programs on human factors, on seafarers' well-being, and on their mental health.